So today is Easter Sunday, the single most important event in human history. But it sure did not start out that way, as we saw today. Mary Magdalene, Peter, and the beloved disciple are grieving, as all the disciples were. They're in shock. They're devastated by the events that we just remembered during Holy Week. Their beloved teacher, the one that they've given themselves to follow, has been crucified as a criminal. They are in the wilderness of grief. They are in the wilderness of anger. They are in the wilderness of disappointment. And they are afraid, as they should be, for their own lives. They aren't sure anymore what it is that they believe. They're not sure anything is solid. They're not even sure how they're going to make it through this day. The movement that they've been a part of seems to have been squelched. The hopes and dreams that Jesus inspired in them seem to have died with him. Maybe today we can relate to that grief, that anger, that disappointment, that fear more than we could at any other Easter in our memory. Who among us doesn't understand grief a little bit more? Who among us doesn't understand being afraid? Who among us doesn't understand disappointment and anger at what's happening? Who among us hasn't wondered, what is it that I believe? Who among us hasn't wondered what, if anything, is still solid in my life? Who among us hasn't wondered, can I get through this day? This is an uncomfortable place for us to be. It's an uncomfortable place to be living, as the early disciples were living in this uncomfortable place. But this is a place where we can be personally touched by the message of Easter. And that is my hope and prayer for all of us. There's a reason that the church doesn't rush to Easter. There's a reason that we take our time preparing ourselves for this mystery. There's a reason that we created this season of Lent, which was 40 days, hearkening back to the 40 days of Jesus in the wilderness and the 40 years of the people of Israel in the wilderness. We have been wandering through the wilderness. It began on Ash Wednesday, February 26th. How long does that feel in the past? It feels like months and months since we began this journey. And this year we made a commitment to look at and to practice and to reflect upon the Christian ninefold path, also known as the Beatitudes. Little did we know when we started this journey that we would be thrust into this collective wilderness experience, that each of us would be challenged to the core by this COVID-19 crisis. But I've been saying it as often as I can, that the wilderness is a place none of us want to be, but it is the place where God does God's best and most transformative work in our lives. And have you noticed as we've walked through this wilderness that it brings out the best in people and the worst? It tempts us to just zone out, to check out, to retreat, to run from all the difficulties that are facing us. And so we're tempted with zoning out, but it also can bring out the best, and we can tune in ways that we don't usually tune in. And we can lean in and embrace whatever opportunities there are in this moment. I think Jesus calls us to tune in, to look at life through his eyes, to experience life with his heart, and to envision a world with the mind of Christ, a world in which God's kingdom comes on earth as it is in heaven, God's dream for this world that we're a part of. So let's look briefly at where we've come from, because I think looking back helps us to understand what today is all about. As we were reflecting this Lent, we remembered that the Beatitudes are not about the future. They're actually about the present. Jesus isn't saying, blessed will be, happy will be. He's saying, no, blessed are, happy are the poor in spirit, as an example. It's about the present. It's about what the blessed and the happy people look like right here, right now, right in front of us. And the people that we think are blessed and are happiest are in fact those who aren't. Jesus is saying that the happiest people are not those who have everything figured out. They're not the people who protect themselves and wall themselves off from pain and suffering and grief. The happiest people aren't trying to be more than they are or less than they are. The happiest people haven't satisfied every longing in their heart. The happiest people aren't those who believe they're always right. The happiest people are not those who look perfect on the outside. The happiest people aren't those who are always competing and trying to win. The happiest people aren't those who avoid criticism at all costs. The happiest people aren't the most popular people. Jesus calls us to tune in, to look even closer and to see that the happiest people, the people who are most blessed, know that they don't know, are willing to learn how to grieve, are content being who they are, no more and no less. The happiest people have that ache for justice and for righteousness. They understand how wrong they've been in the past and they're willing to admit it. The happiest people are allowing the Spirit of God to change them from the inside out. The happiest people are learning how to cooperate with others. The happiest people are not afraid of criticism. The happiest people are willing to speak up and to stand out, to ruffle feathers when necessary. You see, the Beatitudes are not about the future. They're about the present. They're about right here, right now. And here's the thing. So is Easter. It's not just about the future. It's about the present. That's why John's story doesn't end with Mary recognizing Jesus as the gardener. It doesn't stop there. The story continues. And in fact, Jesus sends Mary away to go tell the disciples. And in the story that I shared earlier, it continues with a breakfast on the beach with all the disciples gathered and Peter and Jesus off to the side, having that powerful exchange where Jesus asks one question. He asks it 3 times. He says, "Peter, do you love me?" And every time he says, "Of course I do." And then Jesus makes that connection. If you love me, you'll love your brothers and sisters in your human family. You see, Easter is not a one-time magic show. It's not a ticket out of this life. It's a ticket, an entry point into reality. We have been freed from the power of sin and death. Hallelujah. But we've been freed for the work of love. I think that's what Jesus is trying to teach Peter. And I think that's what Jesus is teaching all of us. We've been in school together. We'll continue to be in school together. He's teaching the same lesson to us every single day until it gets through. We are being invited to be freed, to live sacrificially, to live fearlessly and courageously, to love as Jesus loves. So I've been thinking, what does that look like? Let me give you just a few examples. It looks like a young 20-something from Tennessee who heard about Mother Teresa and didn't want to just read about her in the book, but actually wanted to go meet her. And so that's what he did. He went to Calcutta to meet her and to work alongside her. And his only job during the years that he was in Calcutta was just to love as she was loving, to touch the leper, to see Christ in the most vulnerable among us. And he said, as I started to do that, the gospel turned from black and white into color. And he began to see things totally different with the eyes of Jesus, the heart of Jesus, and the mind of Christ. And he began to recognize that the miracles in the Gospels are not that Jesus rose Lazarus from the dead. It's not that Jesus healed the sick or fed the 5,000. He said the real miracle is that Jesus loved Lazarus enough that he wept. The real miracle is that Jesus touched the leper because no one else would touch the leper. The real miracle is that Jesus cared that they were hungry and he did what he could to feed them. The truth is, Lazarus would die just 2 years later. And these sick people that Jesus healed, I'm sure they died of something, and they were sick again. And even the poor that Jesus fed, they were probably hungry again. The real miracle, the real power was in the love that Jesus demonstrated and embodied. A second example comes to us from Martin Luther King's life. In 1956, he had just become a father. Yolanda was born. He'd been married to Coretta for a period of time, and he was becoming more and more visible to the nation. And he received an invitation to lead a bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. And the moment he accepted that invitation, the death threats started to rise. And then one night, he was pretty overwhelmed. He was drifting off to sleep, and the phone rang. And on the other end of that phone call was the most vitriolic, racist voice he'd ever heard. And the man on the other side said to him, "If you go to Montgomery, Alabama, you'll never come home again." King was shaken. And he went downstairs. He was afraid for his own life. And he was afraid for his daughter. And he was afraid for his wife. He had come to the end of his rope. And he said, "God, I can't do this. It's too much." And he was looking for a graceful way to exit, to step away from all of this. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are you when you are at the end of your rope, for there is less of you and more of God. And as he prayed on that kitchen table, something happened. He said, the love of God, the power of God touched me in a way that I'd never been touched before. And a voice spoke to me and said, "Stand up, Martin. Stand up for justice. Stand up for righteousness. Stand up for truth. And I will be with you until the end." He said, the fear just went out of me. And I realized that with God's help, I could face anything. And he did. These are hard moments to face. We are in the wilderness. There is no denying it. And yet, here's the thing. We've been here before as Christians. We have been here before. If you've joined Westside in the last 8 years, you've heard me tell this story. But the early church was just a bunch of disciples trying to care for each other. They didn't know what they were doing. There was no great plan. The early church would eventually grow into what it is today. And it didn't happen because the perfection of their theology or the power of the preaching, as much as I'd love to think that was the case. It wasn't. The church grew because the power of Christian love, the way that the Christians in that Roman Empire took care of each other and took care of the most vulnerable among us, the poorest of poor, the widow, the orphan, the leper, everyone, no exception. That's what they were taught to do. And that's what they did. And they were persecuted by Rome. And in the 2nd and in the 3rd century, there were not one, but 2 great plagues, which decimated Rome and devastated them and killed off 1/4 of the people that were alive at that time. And when people ran from the hills, out of the city, to get as far away as they could from the great plague, guess who stayed? Guess who stayed? To care for each other, to care for anybody who needed to be cared for. And then in the 3rd century, the Romans came back, everything was back to normal, and they started persecuting the Christians again. But this time something had changed. The ground had shifted beneath their feet, because people had been touched by the love of these early Christians. And when Rome tried to crush him again, this time people stood up. And those who were silent began to speak out. And it were the pagans who pushed hard against Rome. And that's ultimately what opened things up. I'm not sure it was the beginning of a better story, because in some ways, when it became the religion of the empire, it lost some of that early power. But that's how it happened. You know that song, "They will know we are Christians by our love, by our love." I think that's the hymn of Easter. With all due respect, Jesus Christ is risen today is a beautiful hymn, and we sang it today, and we'll sing it every year with gusto. But in the end, what does it all mean unless it becomes incarnated in love? Yeah, Jesus Christ is risen today. He has destroyed the power of sin and death so that we can follow in his footsteps and love as he loves the least, the last, the lonely, the broken, the marginalized, the sick, the poor. That's what Easter's about. That's what the resurrection is for. And you and I can tap into that resurrecting love and power right here and right now. And I think Jesus wants that more than anything else. Today is the single most important day in the course of human history. But the work is before us now. Will we zone out or will we tune in? Will we try to escape reality, or will we let Jesus lead us into the heart of reality and the heart of God and the heart of God's love for all people? And here's the promise of Easter, which we'll celebrate at the table in a little bit. That the one who met King at the kitchen table promised to be with him to the very end. And he was. In 1963, on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, as Martin Luther King had prepared for that moment to address the crowds, he had prepared a different ending than the one he eventually preached. And as he was coming barreling down to the finish line, he was ready to go in this direction, and something didn't feel right. And he started to improvise. And Mahalia Jackson, the late great gospel singer who had performed earlier in the day, was there. And she said, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." As every preacher knows, you're only as good and as powerful as the community that loves and prays for you and supports you and encourages you and pushes you and challenges you. And King was pushed to the edge, and he told the crowd that day about a dream. And that dream is the meaning of Easter. That dream is God's dream for us. It is Jesus' dream for the disciples. It's his dream for you and for me. And they will know we are Christians by our love. One of you shared with me this very simple distillation of the Easter message, and I leave these words with you. They've been living in my heart ever since I heard them. And here they are. Jesus was born singing love. He lived singing love. He died singing love. And he rose in silence. And now, if the song is going to continue, we have to do the singing. Happy Easter.